Welcome back to From the Ashtray. This episode is not about forgotten history. It's about the kind of history that burned itself into the minds of every man who walked through it. This is the story of the Battle of Fallujah, told from the ground through the eyes of the warriors who fought it. But before the bullets and the smoke, before the blood and the flame, there was a city and a warning. They called it the City of Mosques. Fallujah sat about 40 miles west of Baghdad, nestled along the Euphrates River, an old trading town, a place of conservative Sunni values, tribal loyalties, and deep religious heritage. Before the war, Fallujah was known for its discipline. It was one of the few cities where Saddam Hussein didn't feel the need to maintain a heavy security presence because the people handled things their own way. Tight-knit, proud, armed, and deeply distrustful of outsiders. When American troops first entered Iraq in 2003, Fallujah didn't explode with resistance immediately, like some other areas. In fact, when the 82nd Airborne Division first rolled in, the locals mostly watched from their homes. There was tension, but there wasn't blood, at least not yet. Then came the occupation, the raids, the house searches, and the cultural misunderstandings. Marines posted on rooftops, men pulled out of their homes for questioning, and stories of humiliation and shots fired in the night. And then, on April 28th, 2003, just weeks after Saddam's regime collapsed, U.S. troops opened fire on a crowd of civilians during a protest outside a school they had occupied as a base. 17 Iraqis were killed. Dozens more were wounded. And just like that, Fallujah began to boil. Fallujah became a magnet for fighters, former Ba'athists, tribal militias, Islamists, and foreign jihadists. It became a fortress of resistance in the Al-Anbar province, a place where convoys were ambushed, IEDs were planted daily, and black-clad fighters slipped through alleys with RPGs and cell phones, watching every U.S. patrol with hawk-eyes. As Bing West wrote in No True Glory, quote, Fallujah was the command post of the insurgency, and it mocked America, end quote. And the Marines called it the Devil's Den. Every squad that went in knew they might not come back out. By early 2004, Fallujah had become what the military called a no-go zone. It was unofficially off limits unless a mission absolutely required it. It's how bad things had gotten. But then something happened that forced America's hand. March 31st, 2004, 4 American contractors from Blackwater, USA, were driving through Fallujah in 2 SUVs. They were armed, lightly armored, cocky. Some say they were warned not to take that route. Others say they were under orders. It doesn't matter. They never made it through. The insurgents ambushed the convoy, killed all 4 men, burned their bodies, and hung the charred remains of 2 from the old green bridge over the Euphrates. Photos hit global media within hours. It wasn't just a tactical loss. It was a humiliation. A shot straight to the American gut, and it demanded a response. And just like that, President Bush gave the go-ahead. Fallujah would be retaken. What followed was Operation Vigilant Resolve, the first Battle of Fallujah. In early April of 2004, 1st Marine Expeditionary Force prepared to enter Fallujah. They were told it would be fast, surgical, and limited. Just enough force to send a message. Commanders wanted to avoid heavy civilian casualties, and the brass didn't want bad optics. But the insurgents had been preparing for this. They had fortified the city, stockpiled weapons, and turned homes, mosques, and even hospitals into bunkers. They had IEDs laid out in the streets, snipers in the minarets, and traps in the sewers. When the Marines entered, they were hit from every direction. Corporal Jason Dominguez said in a later interview, quote, "Every door could be a bomb. Every window could be a muzzle. We'd clear a house, step outside, and get lit up from the next one. It was like a living hell maze." End quote. The fighting was fierce, chaotic, and urban. Door to door, room to room. They had to use N1 Abrams tanks to blast through walls and AC-130 gunships at night to hold the line. But as casualties mounted, both military and civilian, the international media began broadcasting images of dead women and children. And the political pressure hit fast and hard. After just 2 weeks of combat, and without securing the city, U.S. forces were ordered to stand down. And the first Battle of Fallujah was over. Just like that. It was considered an utter failure. Instead of occupying Fallujah themselves, U.S. leadership tried a different strategy. They handed control of the city to a newly created Fallujah Brigade, made up of former Iraqi army officers and locals, some with direct ties to insurgent networks. On paper, it was a compromise. In reality, it was an absolute disaster. And within weeks, the Fallujah Brigade collapsed. Weapons were handed over to the insurgents. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Abu Musab al-Zakwawi, used the opportunity to turn Fallujah into a stronghold. And by the summer of 2004, it wasn't just a haven, it was the heart of the insurgency. The U.S. had been publicly shamed, the enemy had regrouped, and the Marines, they knew they'd be back. And this time, there'd be no holding back. In October of 2004, the orders came down. Fallujah would be taken. All of it. And this time, the gloves were fucking off. Operation Phantom Fury, or Al-Fajr, the Dawn, as the Iraqis called it, would be the largest urban assault by U.S. forces since Ho City, Vietnam. Roughly 13,000 American troops were being mobilized for this. Infantry, engineers, snipers, medics, logistics, recon, and armor. The British and Iraqi forces would provide support on the outer corridor. Inside the city, estimates put the number of insurgents between 2,000 and 4,000. Some of them foreign fighters, and many of them were experienced. They had months to prepare. Every block was a kill zone. Every house was a potential trap. And the Marines knew that they were walking into a slaughterhouse. One Marine reportedly said during the briefing, quote, "If you believe in God, you better start talking to him." End quote. In early April 2004, the city of Fallujah was surrounded, and the United States Marine Corps, specifically the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, had orders: isolate the city, cut it off, and then root out the insurgents who had claimed it. The mission was called Operation Vigilant Resolve. And this wasn't just some hard-hitting name slapped onto a briefing folder. This was meant to be an example. It was meant to be a warning, a message to any Iraqi insurgents who thought the U.S. military could be challenged. Over 2,000 Marines, backed by Army units, armored columns, snipers, and air support, moved in with surgical and at times brutal precision. But what they encountered inside Fallujah was not just ragtag fighters. It was a city turned fortress. Fallujah's insurgents were definitely not green. Many were veterans of Saddam Hussein's military or of the Mujahideen from other conflicts. They knew the terrain, the alleys, the homes. They had stockpiled weapons, laid ambushes, planted IEDs, and used the civilian population as both cover and leverage because they were cowards. Only a coward would use women and children as a shield. To the Marines entering the city, everyone could be an enemy. To the people of Fallujah, especially the innocents, everyone looked like an occupier. And in the middle of that no man's land was the truth. Nobody was safe. U.S. forces advanced cautiously but deliberately. Sniper teams established overwatch positions on rooftops. M1 Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles provided armor, but this was urban combat at its nastiest. Marines took fire from mosques, schools, and homes. Insurgents fired from the alleyways and then disappeared into the labyrinth of tunnels. In many cases, the only way to clear a building was to kick the door in and go room by room. House to house wasn't a figure of speech, it was a policy, and a policy that these men lived. That led to heavy casualties on both sides, and tragically, among civilians. The estimates vary, but between 600 and 800 Iraqis were killed during the initial assault. Many of them were non-combatants. The U.S. losses were fewer, around 27 killed and over 100 wounded, but every casualty was felt like a gut punch to the American home front. Then the political fallout came, fast and hard. Al Jazeera broadcast footage of civilian casualties 24/7. Images of bombed out homes, bloodied children, and wailing families dominated Arab television. In Baghdad, the Iraqi Governing Council, handpicked by the U.S., threatened to resign in protest. Even with the Bush administration, alarm bells were ringing. The optics of besieging an Iraqi city during a supposed mission of liberation was absolutely fucking disastrous. And so, just 3 weeks into the assault, with the Marines closing in on the heart of Fallujah, the plug was pulled. Just like that. April 30th, 2004, Operation Vigilant Resolve was officially called off. And to many of the Marines on the ground, it felt like betrayal. They had fought, bled, and lost brothers in the streets, only to be told to stand down before finishing the job. To stand down, watched their brothers fight, die. Some insurgents melted away into the night. Others stayed and regrouped. And Fallujah became a symbol. To the insurgency, it was proof that the United States could be forced to blink. To the Marines and soldiers who fought there, it was unfinished business. But what really changed after Vigilant Resolve? The Fallujah Brigade, a hastily formed local security force led by former Ba'athist officers, was created to maintain order in the city. It was a compromise meant to cool tensions without full U.S. occupation. But in reality, it was an absolute fucking disaster. Many of its members had no loyalty to the new Iraqi government or to the Americans. Weapons meant for the brigade ended up in the hands of the insurgents, and the fighters who had faced down the Marines were now back in control. Fallujah became a city under insurgent rule, a no-go zone for coalition forces, and within months, it was clear a reckoning was coming. Fallujah wasn't pacified, it was boiling, waiting. What came next would make April look like a rehearsal. And the next operation wouldn't be called Resolve. It would be called Phantom Fury. And this time, the gloves were coming all the way off. When the smoke cleared in April 2004, Fallujah was still standing, bruised, battered, but standing. The insurgents inside didn't just survive, they claimed victory. U.S. forces had pulled back, the Iraqi government looked weak, and the city had become a rallying cry for jihadists across Iraq and beyond. But the U.S. wasn't done. Oh no, far from it. In November 2004, the gloves finally came completely off, and what followed was the most ferocious urban battle the U.S. military had fought since Vietnam. And on paper, the plan was simple. Encircle the city, cut it off, and then destroy every enemy fighter inside. But in reality, it was war at its most brutal. Operation Phantom Fury, also called Al-Fajr, the Dawn, by Iraqi forces, was a joint U.S.-Iraqi offensive to retake Fallujah. And this time, there would be no half measures, no ceasefires, no pullbacks. This was going to be a kill box. The numbers alone were staggering. Over 13,000 coalition troops, mostly Marines, along with Army mechanized units, Navy SEALs, British forces, and Iraqi commandos. They faced an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 insurgents dug deep into the city, armed with AKs, RPGs, machine guns, IEDs, booby traps, and pure fanaticism. Many had pledged allegiance to Abu Musab al-Zawahiri, the brutal leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Some had come from outside Iraq to join what they believed would be the defining battle against the American occupation. And on November 7th, The offensive began with an air campaign to soften the defenses. AC-130 gunships and fighter jets pounded suspected insurgent positions. Then came the ground assault. The 1st Marine Division, Army's 2nd Infantry Division, and the U.S. Army Rangers launched coordinated strikes from the north and west. Engineers breached barricades and cleared IEDs. Tanks just rolled into the suburbs. But Fallujah was no ordinary battlefield. It was a warren of tight alleyways, concrete homes, minarets, and tunnels. Every block had to be cleared by hand. Marines and soldiers fought room to room, house by house. Insurgents had fortified entire neighborhoods, booby-trapping doors, hiding behind false walls, and setting up kill zones inside homes. A rifle squad might enter a building and fight through multiple levels, only to find an IED planted under the staircase or a trap door leading to another armed group hidden below. In one case, Marines discovered a network of insurgent tunnels running under homes, connecting sniper nests and ambush points. Every doorway could be a death sentence, every window a sniper's nest, and every civilian was a potential enemy. It was during Phantom Fury that American forces began using thermobaric weapons, brutal, high-pressure explosives designed to suck oxygen from enclosed spaces. These were used to clear bunkers and harden positions where traditional explosives would have normally failed. They also deployed was the MK-77 incendiary bomb, a controversial weapon with effects similar to napalm. Officially, its use was limited, but it left behind a scorched hellscape and fueled accusations of war crimes from foreign media outlets and human rights organizations around the world. The Marines didn't just bring bullets, they brought fire. And by mid-November, progress was slow, but undeniable. U.S. forces had taken key objectives: the main hospital, the train station, bridges, and most of the industrial sector. But the heart of the city, the Jolan district in the northwest, became a last stand. Fighters there dug in and resisted with fanatical intensity. They used civilians as shields, again showing that they're fucking cowards, launched suicide attacks, and ambushed Marines from sewer openings. The fighting became some of the most savage of the entire war. Casualties mounted, and entire squads were lost to ambushes or building collapses. By the end of November, the city was in U.S. hands, but at a massive cost. The final toll: over 100 U.S. troops were killed, more than 600 wounded. Iraqi forces suffered dozens of deaths. And as for the insurgents, estimates suggest over 2,000 were killed. But what about the civilians? Nobody knows for sure. Some say 800, others suggest over 1,500. Most were trapped between bullets and bombs, unable to flee before the siege. The city was flattened. Over 70% of buildings were damaged or destroyed. Fallujah wasn't just a battlefield anymore, guys. It became a graveyard. Fallujah was liberated, air quotes. That's the word the press releases used. What does that really mean? I mean, there were no parades, no cheers from the locals, no welcome home banners. Just silence. Broken by the buzz of flies over rubble and the distant echoes of what had been a city. When Marines and soldiers finally pushed through the last pockets of resistance in late November 2004, the battle may have been won, but the war was not anywhere close to being over. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Water and electricity were cut off for weeks. Basic supplies were scarce, and despite the evacuation orders, many civilians just never left. They were found dead in their homes, buried under debris, or injured and too afraid to seek help. Fallujah's population, once over 250,000, had mostly vanished, scattered across refugee camps, other Iraqi cities, or temporary shelters. And what was left was a shell of a city. For the U.S. military, Operation Phantom Fury became a textbook case in urban warfare tactics. The use of cordon and sweep strategies, small unit room clearing techniques, real-time drone coordination, and psychological operations. But behind those bullet points was real trauma. Troops came home changed. PTSD became rampant among those who fought in Fallujah. Not just because of what they saw, but because of what they had to do. Some had to shoot at vehicles that ignored checkpoints, only to find women or children inside. Others pulled the trigger in a dark alleyway or dark hallway, only to realize later it wasn't an insurgent. And many saw their friends die violently and horrendously, blown apart by IEDs, sniped through a window, or burned alive in a Bradley after a hit from an RPG. Fallujah didn't just wound bodies, it broke minds. Back in the States, the story was different, depending on who you asked. The Pentagon called it a major success and a decisive blow to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But human rights groups, Arab media, and independent journalists told another story of indiscriminate bombing, civilian deaths, and controversial weapons like white phosphorus. There were allegations that some war crimes had occurred, especially regarding how prisoners were treated and how certain buildings were cleared. And then came the propaganda war. Footage of burning buildings, corpses in the streets, and women wailing over dead children spread like wildfire across the internet and Middle Eastern TV stations. For insurgent recruiters, Fallujah became a fucking gold mine. They used it to radicalize the new generation. And sure enough, by 2006, Al-Qaeda in Iraq had morphed into something far worse. ISIS. Fallujah wouldn't stay quiet. In 2014, nearly a decade later, the city once again fell, this time to the black flags of the Islamic State. It took yet another bloody campaign by Iraqi forces and U.S. airstrikes to take it back. Different year, different war. Same city, same ghosts. By late December 2004, the major combat operations in Fallujah had concluded. U.S. forces had effectively taken control of the city, or at least what was left of it. Marines and soldiers began the process of withdrawing from the most contested zones and establishing semi-permanent outposts for stabilization and patrols. The victory came at a price. The city lay in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to piles of rubble. Schools, hospitals, mosques, even cemeteries had been bombed or torn apart by the fighting. Of Fallujah's 300,000 residents, an estimated 250,000 had fled before the battle had begun. Most would return months later, only to find their homes leveled, their businesses destroyed, and their loved ones buried beneath concrete and dust. And those who did remain, either by choice or because they had no way out, paid a heavy price. Some civilians have been caught in the crossfires, others killed in mistaken identity strikes or by snipers. There were credible reports from humanitarian agencies and journalists that civilians had been denied access to medical care during the siege, and that bodies had been left in the streets for days before being recovered. The human cost was not just limited to the Iraqis. 95 American troops were killed during Operation Phantom Fury. Over 560 were wounded. And the psychological trauma, moral injury, and survivor's guilt that many of those men carried with them back home would haunt them for years, and for most of them still haunts them to this day. The Battle of Fallujah left scars that didn't show up on casualty reports. And then came the long tale of the war, the aftermath that nobody really planned for. The U.S. military claimed Fallujah was a turning point. A message had been sent, and insurgents would no longer have safe havens, and the coalition would not hesitate to root them out wherever they operated. But that narrative unraveled very quickly. Despite the massive effort to secure the city, many of the top insurgent leaders escaped before the battle even began. Abu Musab al-Zakwari, the figurehead of the jihadist presence in Iraq, remained at large. The insurgency didn't die in Fallujah. It mutated, it learned, it grew. What the U.S. achieved in firepower, it lost in perception. Across Iraq and the broader Arab world, Fallujah became a symbol, not of terrorist defeat, but of American aggression. Images of mosques reduced to rubble, charred bodies in the streets, and reports of chemical weapons being used, whether substantiated or not, fueled resentment and radicalization. And that leads us to one of the darkest, most controversial legacies of the battle: the alleged use of white phosphorus and depleted uranium munitions during the assault. Officially, the U.S. military admitted to using white phosphorus rounds as a smokescreen and illumination tool. But reports began emerging in late 2005 and 2006, alleging that white phosphorus was also used directly on enemy combatants and potentially on civilians. in violation of international norms. An Italian documentary titled Fallujah, The Hidden Massacre, brought the issue to the global audience, showing graphic footage of civilians with severe chemical burns. Pentagon pushed back, stating that white phosphorus was a lawful weapon when used properly. But the damage had already been done. The allegations, combined with rising cancer rates and birth defects in Fallujah in the years that followed, created a lasting controversy about the environmental and humanitarian impact of the battle. Even the most hardened U.S. veterans of Fallujah wrestled with the moral complexity of the fight. They'd gone in under orders, believing they were fighting for stability, to eliminate a threat, and to avenge their fallen. But when the smoke cleared, the victory felt hollow. The insurgency spread. Sectarian violence spiraled. And the city that was supposed to be pacified became a ghost town. Later, falling back under insurgent control just a few years later during the rise of ISIS. So, in the words of a Marine who fought there, quote, "We were told we were fighting the worst of the worst. And maybe some of them were, but we destroyed an entire city. Killed hundreds, if not thousands of people. And what do we have to show for it? Fallujah fell to ISIS in 2014. The same damn place we bled and died for." End quote. Yeah, I mean, if you're not getting it by now, this far into the story, we created ISIS with what we did in Fallujah. The Battle of Fallujah wasn't just a battle, it was a warning. A warning about the limits of firepower, a warning about the cost of occupation, and a warning about what happens when war becomes about optics and messaging rather than about people. And yeah, there are people out there, you know, war is hell. People die in war. As true as that is, we do need to keep our morality in check. We need to be more conscious. We need to be more aware. And for the Iraqis who lost their homes, their families, their city, Fallujah became a crater in their memory, a place of ghosts and silence. For the Americans who fought there, whether they supported the mission or not, it became a defining moment in a war that never seemed to end. And for the rest of us, Fallujah is just a reminder that sometimes the battles that make headlines are not the ones that win wars, but the ones that break nations, fracture minds, and leave scars that last generations. I've said it before and I'll say it again. We need to learn from the sins of our past if we want to have a better future. The only way we can understand the sins of our past is not being afraid to speak about them and to learn about them. Anyway, I hope you liked this episode. If you're listening on Spotify, please leave a rating, comment, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, subscribe, hit that follow button, turn on your notifications, like the video. This is Calix this is Calix Rivers from the Ashtray. Thank you for listening.